So, welcome back to our conversation about the human animal and the human predicament. And today I'd like to talk about stress. This is something most of us are curious about. We want to know what stress does to our bodies, what it does to our lives, and in some cases, how do we make stress go away, that kind of thing. But our understanding is compromised right at the outset because stress in popular media is pigeonholed in the health and wellness and lifestyle category. And in that category, stress is presented to us as an individual problem with individual solutions. Stress is something that will compromise your athletic performance and lead to premature aging and all of these things about you or me. And that's it. That's as far as that conversation goes. But we have to be bigger because stress has profound effects that operate beyond the level of the individual, that have enormous effects on society and culture and our ability to create some kind of functional future. So, with that in mind, I'd like to read a list of stress effects that go beyond the level of just individual health and wellness. And all of this is bad news, by the way. This is a pretty challenging list. Stress leads to a general contraction of human intelligence and awareness. It decreases our imagination and our curiosity precisely at the moment when we need it. It leads to a kind of context blindness and short-term thinking. We're less likely to see the interdependence of the natural world around us. Stress leads to increased perceptions of scarcity in the world, even when things are affluent, even when things are fundamentally rich. We see more scarcity, and that leads to hoarding behaviors of consumer goods, power, money, all the rest. Stress increases our fear sensitivity and leads to a kind of hypervigilance. We become more suspicious of institutions and the people around us. Stress leads to an increase in zero-sum thinking. In other words, we begin to see human relationships exclusively as competitive, adversarial transactions. Stress leads to an increase in toxic tribalism, especially polarization, but even worse than that, a sense of tribe over truth. In other words, we become so attached and affiliated to our particular social groups that we lose sight of what's actually true. Stress leads to increases in obedience and conformity and groupthink, which is to say it diminishes our creativity. Stress leads to political extremism. It decreases our ambiguity tolerance. And in the process, it leads some people to an increased desire for strongman solutions. In other words, we look to dictators and autocrats to solve our problems. We can't deal with the complexity of the world, but maybe a strongman can. For other people, it leads to an increased desire for amusement and entertainment and escapism. And for everybody, it leads to a reversion to the familiar. In other words, when faced with the complexity and ambiguity of the world, we tend to go back to the last thing that we knew and understood. And in this case, in our case, that's consumer culture. And on the personal level, it leads to an increased reliance on habit. We go back to the last thing that worked for us, even if it was maladaptive. And finally, stress leads to a decreased sense of our common humanity. We start to see people as simply obstacles in our way. They become simply externalities in our calculations. So you can see how bad this is and how consequential it is. And all of this is made worse by the fact that we're not talking about this. We see these things as isolated human behaviors that have nothing to do with one another, but really, stress is at the root of all this. Stress is very much a public health problem. And yet we're not talking about it. We don't see leadership on this. Our political leaders sometimes talk about economic distress, but we don't talk about the general sense of stress that afflicts the human animal. And that's an oversight that is going to be extremely problematic going forward. So if you're somebody who works with a human animal, it's really clear what we need to do. We need to do the familiar practices in our own personal lives. We need to exercise more. We need to sleep more. We need to spend more time in nature. We need to spend more time meditating. Surround yourself with supportive people. Have some meaningful work. All of these things. We've heard this list 1,000 times. It's a good list. But we also need to be bigger. And we need to exercise leadership in the world of stress and start talking about these issues. Because if we fail to take this seriously, then that's going to undermine our ability to move forward with some kind of ecologically functional world. So yes, time has come to take stress seriously. See you next time.